Hey folks, if you're looking for an in-depth review, you're in the right place. And today I'm going to be making good on the promise I made in my Scott Pilgrim review, since I got a hold of a review copy of Way Forward's beat-em-up, River City Girls 2. Join me as I fling into the fray and find out if this River City Rumble was a smashing sequel, or if the only gossip I have about the girls is galling. I'm your host Arlyeon, let's find out together. Last time on River City Girls. After Masako and Kyoko's boyfriends went missing, the gals tried their hands at playing junior detective and rapidly found themselves immersed in a criminal conspiracy culminating in a duel with Sabuko, the daughter of the local Yakuza head. That in a multi-story defenestration. Despite the fact that she didn't have anything to do with the boy's disappearance, still, she was disgraced all the same, something which has aroused both the interest and ire of her father, provided an opportunity for her brother Ken to take the stage, with his own revenge plot in the works. Like taking over the school and getting the girls expelled. That said, the real cherry on this situation is that, rather than precipitate a roaring rampage of revenge, the girls simply take this time to play video games and slack off. At least, until a fresh game release motivates them into leaving the house and discovering just how bad things in River City have recently gotten. Narratively speaking, this is introduced to you early on through a series of scenes, alternating between in-game segments and some comic book styled cutscenes. And honestly, it's a pretty fun premise, and it actually works as far as sequels go, because the first game did a pretty decent job of establishing Masako and Kyoko as self-centered, headstrong, and a bit dense. Plus, there's something legitimately funny in the fact that they provided some justification for how you lost all those levels you gained in the last game. All that effort just evaporated over the course of several months spent being couch potatoes as everything went to hell in a handbasket. Admittedly, this game does feel like it leans a little bit more on meta humor, but even if you're not a fan of that, there's still plenty of genuinely funny moments, especially for fans of the first game. A number of which can be further explored through the game's side quests, since they not only provide useful resources, they also serve as an opportunity to reintroduce a number of characters from the last installment, and what they've been up to since you've last seen them. All in all, I'd have to say that River City Girls 2 does a decent job of upping the overall stakes of the story, since Ken does a solid job of establishing himself as an antagonist early on, and quickly sets you on a collision course with his villainous lieutenants. And god are some of the segments involving them hilarious. The mid-boss dialogue for Primo is just... it's a chef kiss. Still, as fun as things are, including the back and forth that accompanies your roamings, I did start to notice some flaws here and there. For instance, dialogue does differentiate a bit with different characters in the party, which should feel notable since there's a total of 6 characters, which in turn allows for a number of different permutations. That said, it doesn't actually seem to add much or change all that much in practice. Even doing something like dragging Marianne, the damsel from the Double Dragon games, to chat with Skullmageddon, the villain from Double Dragon Neon who kidnapped her, doesn't seem to really majorly change things up, which is a bit of a shame. I will, however, confess that I didn't have a trio of friends or more to kidnap into the experience with me, so I wasn't able to fully test the limits of this feature and how much that might impact the way conversations go when it's forced to take into account a corte of characters, for instance. As a last story note, if you were a major fan of the hidden ending in the first game, I should emphasize that currently there only appears to be one, though the conclusion does feel fairly satisfying. Which brings us to the mechanics of this brawler and what's changed since its predecessor, and what hasn't, I suppose, since as an experience it still feels quite similar, providing a very River City Ransom-esque experience as you slowly explore a city replete with hoodlums and trounce them for the experience and money you'll be needing. That said, it won't be long until you notice some key differences. For instance, since your boyfriends are already rescued this time around, you're actually provided the option of starting with 4 distinct characters. That's far from the only difference you'll notice at the gate as well if you're coming into this from its predecessor, since the overall game feels considerably larger, offering expanded versions of areas from its predecessor alongside an array of brand new city segments. What's more, while the quests will initially oblige you to tackle a certain set of segments, it won't be long until things become a bit more open-ended, allowing you to choose which segment of the plot to progress first, and overall granting a lot more flexibility insofar as exploring the city. Admittedly, I would recommend poking your nose into both story branches, at least to some small degree, since doing so provides you access to the last two characters meant to round out your roster. Not that you're overly penalized for grabbing them later, since while only your active characters gain experience from knocking out thugs, every character is granted experience and money from completing side and main quests, even if you haven't recruited them yet. That said, I genuinely adored playing as Arlyeon, one of the new characters, in large part because this game does brawlers justice. See, some of you folks might have recently watched my review of Scott Pilgrim, a game I have a certain fondness for, but which ultimately felt very flawed and rather limiting, especially insofar as how they make the characters feel distinct. You don't have to worry about that in this title. While characters' initial movesets do start fairly simple, even from the word go, you're provided more options than the Sex Bob-omb crew, with more fluid combos, the ability to grapple as well as parry. That said, it really doesn't take long for you to gain access to a much broader arsenal. Some of it's near automatic, as some moves are provided by the simple act of leveling up, and do things like extend your combos and allow you more opportunities to link moves together. That said, for the real combo enthusiasts in the audience, or those looking for things that really help to make a character feel distinct, you'll need to visit the dojos. Accessible fairly early on, these provide you the opportunity to spend your hard-earned money on gaining a wide variety of attacks, some of which can be used to further fill out those combos I mentioned earlier, but others which help to allow characters to feel unique. Ricky, for instance, gets an orb he can fire out, which is notable for being able to pass through an enemy and hit them in the back, thereby bypassing enemies' block and setting them up for being juggled into it. Kyoko has some solid mobility moves, a number of which lend themselves to continuous combos, though not quite to the same extent as Pruvi, who has the ability to excessively chain her moves together. Arlyeon, though. Arlyeon has grapples, and there's just something amazing about grabbing someone by the face and then baseball batting all their friends away with their body, or grabbing two adjacent guys and just smooshing their faces together. And even without these tech abilities that require you to build up AP, you still have decent options in your heavy abilities, like launchers or knockbacks, or even defensive measures, like Kyoko's hopback or Arlyeon's weave, which allows her to dodge through an enemy and attack their back if you time it right. It's honestly solid stuff, though I'll admit that the simplicity of dragging enemies into a protracted light attack combo, into an aerial launch, a juggle, and then ending it with an air grab mostly did the job. That might be my fault though, because of my inability to say no to a fight meant I was both over-leveled and rich enough to buy food at just about every convenience store I came across, which is important since, while leveling does give you stats, so does eating food for the first time at these stores, allowing you to get a rather significant amount of survivability and an offensive lead on your foes, since their overall strength is tied to how far into the story you are. Something which also determines the kinds of enemies you're facing off against. I specify kind here, by the by, since there's some quirks to the roaming delinquents you duke it out with in the game. Each one of them actually has a decent little moveset of their own, with some of them being more complex than others. That said, even amongst these groups of enemies are subtypes, which is notable not only because they'll occasionally whip out more vicious combos or abilities than their peers, they'll also provide you access to these alternate abilities. That's right, the Mook recruitment system from River City Girls 1 is back, and it's a fair bit better this time around. Sure, you'll still have to make sure that the Mook you want to pull into your gang is the last person conscious and avoid accidentally overkilling them in a combo, but things are still improved since you actually gain experience and money from recruiting someone now as to before, and you have access to 2 recruit slots, which really helps for setting up custom combos or solid supports to your repertoire, especially given the addition of new enemy types that are introduced as you progress through the game, which provide a solid amount of variety alongside the returning faces from the preceding game. Still, if you're not feeling like playing pugilistic Pokemon with a bunch of Yakuza, there's an option for you all the same, since there's also characters you can recruit for money at specific points in the map. Really, the only downside to these characters is that unlike the mooks, whom you can actually re-recruit once you've found them from any of the scattered hideouts, these latter characters require a fresh batch of cash for every outing if you happen to overwrite their slot or lose them in a pitched battle, since recruits can take damage and after a few hits, they're out of there. Admittedly, because of this financial cost, I tended to focus on my totally not poke thugs, and honestly that was fine because my terrible memory meant it helped to have a few visual reminders around of who I'd already caught on my quest to nab them all. Plus, the rare variants are really strong if you're patient enough to track and catch them. And I did have quite a bit of time on my hands since I went out of my way to do all of the side quests. Like I mentioned earlier, they're fairly rewarding insofar as granting experience and money to every character you have. What's more, the game does a fairly decent job of not only signaling where they are, but even providing a somewhat subtle hint as to where you need to go for the collectible-oriented ones. Specifically, if a segment of your map is red, there's a hidden collectible of some sort there, providing a fair degree of motivation to further explore each region. Though, maybe a bit better than I did, since while I did all of these quests, some of them I managed through very stupid platforming shenanigans, which was not in fact the solution. There were hidden shortcuts, I'm just very dumb and very stubborn in relatively equal measures, which led to me just You know what, I don't actually have any regrets here because it still was pretty rewarding, and even beyond the ones that I had to finagle, it was pretty fun. There's actually some decent puzzles involved in some of these. The selfie quest, for instance, comes to mind since there was a little bit of lateral thinking involved in that, and honestly, there's just some decent rewards to some of these. Being able to meet Kabako from Cat Girl Without Salad, for instance, or gaining access to an accessory that provided unlimited special energy and just further expanded the shenanigans I could do with the characters' movesets. Which accessories? So, these also make a return from River City Girls and function much in the same way, with you acquiring them from shops or from certain side quests, as well as your fundamental limit of being only able to equip 2. That said, there was definitely a lot more this time around and quite a few interesting options in the mix. While some provide direct buffs or circumstantial buffs, like improved parries, there's also some fun options like the Glass Jaw, which drastically increases both your incoming and outgoing damage, as well as the Vampire Teeth, which drain your health over time but cause you to replenish it by defeating enemies. Yes, these two are a lot of fun together. Honestly, there's enough options in the mix that you can make some decent synergies, even if the slot size is rather limiting. It does make the idea of toggling friendly fire on to throw down with a friend sound a bit more interesting all the same, though I suppose that's something I'll have to figure out later because, well, we are now 2 for 2, insofar as my inability to play online with people in brawlers I've recently played with the intention of playing with people. Maybe this'll change while I'm posting this episode or shortly after, but the reason I say this is because I had to opt into the game's beta branch, which disabled my ability to play online co-op in exchange for delicious 60 FPS. Yeah, so for context, without opting into the patch, you'd currently be limited to a somewhat choppy 30 FPS, which is admittedly pretty painful to play through. And here's the thing, I really appreciated being able to see how fluid the combat was in this game. There's a lot of love put into all the characters' animations, whether it's the ones you're playing as or facing off against. Really, there's just a lot of detail put into the sprite work at large that just makes it a treat. Details which also extend to the character portraits during their dialogue segments, as well as the comic book segments for the more story-centric segments. All in all, this title looks quite good. That said, if I have to pick anything about this game's presentation that I love the most, it's the audio. It is, on the whole, it's just well done with voice acting, which even extends to when you swap characters around in the story and have someone else speaking those lines, and punching someone just sounds so satisfying. That said, the part which I truly adore is the music because there is a fresh array of catchy tunes to listen to, as well as ample opportunities to listen to the tracks from the first game. And that's the long of things, so let's try and boil things down for the conclusion. And story-wise, again, I really did appreciate the direction this game took, as it built off the events of the prior game and ultimately wound up feeling more solid on a narrative front. Likewise, the mechanical side of things definitely feels improved. There's more characters to play as, with broader movesets which all fit together a lot nicer, allowing for much more organic feeling combos, a decent enemy gallery, and a pretty solid arrangement of bosses to battle. Admittedly, not all bosses are created equal, and there is one that actually stuck out as a bit of a nuisance, but on the whole, they definitely felt enjoyable. Also, the more open-ended approach to world design was really nice, with the continued existence of fast travel in the form of bus stops, making it easy to keep on top of all the new regions and just really helped with the whole side questing thing. Really, the only nitpicks that come to mind in a gameplay sense was just the act of having to buy food, since tracking down which places you already ate as a given character is something you need to do manually for each character, which is a fair bit of running around by the time you have the full roster and have unlocked every area, and is also compounded by one of the locations being mobile and fairly random for where it shows up. Still, I had enough fun that if I can wrangle a friend in the mix, I'm very likely to take a crack at its New Game Plus, which is mostly the same beyond the addition of another collectible quest and a pair of new recruits to strive for. Essentially, what I'm trying to say is, as far as brawlers I've recently plunged into, I can safely call this title a hit. Really, the only thing that holds this title back, at least for me, is simply the fact that I didn't have the option to have both 60 FPS and the ability to play with friends. All in all, I had enough fun that I legitimately hope there's more to look for in this franchise, and that the issues pertaining to the multiplayer wind up getting addressed, so I can do that proper victory lap. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. And if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell. For the Discord savvy folks, there's a link to my community, the Crit Hit Cauldron, in the video description, and to my Patreon so you can support me and Hop. Also, to my Twitch if you want to see me get dunked on in indie games live. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.